Good evening, friends. The world we are in today has seen a politicization of interstate relations, a rekindling of great power rivalries, pushbacks to globalization, and an increasingly ineffective global order in terms of dealing with challenges such as the pandemic, economic slowdowns, and wars. The world seems adrift between the old order and the new order, which is yet to emerge. There are risks of a global recession and a debt crisis in the global south. We hope to bring you a discussion not only about the issues and problems that we face, but prescriptions on how we as countries, nations, and industry might cope with rising uncertainty and higher geopolitical risks in the international system. We also need to negotiate down the paths that revolutionary technologies, new energy paradigms, and a new kind of warfare will take us. It's also my pleasure to introduce to you the two wonderful panelists we have. Mr. Shivshankar Menon, whom you've all heard of, I'm sure, is a former national security advisor, former foreign secretary, former ambassador to China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Israel. He's an author of two books, Choices Inside the Making of India's Foreign Policy in 2016, and India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past and Present in 2021, sorry. In the interest of full disclosure, I should say that I have worked with Mr. Menon, and it was always a pleasure, sir, to have reported to you. And
so you know who did the work, right?
That's very kind of you to say so. But I have to tell you, he works very hard, and but he does delegate very graciously when he has to. And on my right is Nitin Pai, who's the co-founder and director of Takshashila Institution, which is, as you all know, an independent center for research and education in public policy. He teaches international relations and public policy. He spent more than a decade in Singapore as a policymaker, particularly on technology, I think. And he's a regular columnist for the Mint and the Print. That rhymes, Nitin. That's sort of funny. And he graduated from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and also the Technical University in Singapore. And he's an engineer by training, as he told me. And I myself am only the moderator, so I'll not go into all the things I've done, but I'm a former diplomat, I'm a former deputy NSA, and I'm a self-proclaimed cyber peace warrior. And I am a fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and an adjunct faculty member at Takshashila Institution. So with that, I'm going to begin with the questions. May I put the first question to both Ambassador Menon and to Nitin? Are we really in an anarchic world today? And what do you see as the main issues that have led us to this point? I'll start with Mr. Menon.
Thank you, Latha, and thank you for that very flattering introduction. Yes, I think we are in a world which is between orders and adrift. Anarchic only in the sense that there isn't a set order of things or there isn't agreement on the structuring of the international system. Because, frankly, this is a normal world. You know, any international system based on nation states is going to involve great power rivalry. We got used to an exceptional sort of 20 years when the US was the sole superpower after the end of the Cold War. Otherwise, if you think back, there hasn't been a time when there hasn't been great power rivalry or contention for hegemony, for dominance. So in some ways, we've gone back to the old business of politics between nation states. But why do I say it's between orders? The last time we mounted a coherent international response to anything was the global financial crisis, 2008. 2009 in London, the G20 met, and they prevented a Great Depression again. They managed to do things to stabilize the international banking system. But after that, every big international crisis, transnational issue, climate change, pandemic, whether it was Ebola or whether it's COVID, you look at the developing country debt crisis. I mean, the IMF says 53 developing countries are at grave risk of defaulting on their debt. And we've been saying this for the last 5 years in the G20 and everywhere, but nobody's done anything about it. So if you look at the big issues, the world economy is slowed down, you look at what's happening on world trade, we are so thrilled when the WTO ministerial manages to do things that don't do anything for world trade. They don't open markets, but we're so happy that they managed to produce a communique. That's how sad it is, actually. So for me, there is no international order which is operating today. And that's why I say we're between orders. And every single great power today is revisionist. Nobody's happy with what there is. Normally, you have at least one or two status quo powers, right, who want to stay where they are, who think they're running things. And for most of our lives, at least, we've got used to a dominant Western, US-led system, both economically and politically, and in terms of providing security. But today, the US talks of building back better. Better means what? Means you don't like what's going on now. And the US, there are grave questions about the US's ability to actually project power or engage because they are concerned they have their own problems at home, as we all know. I mean, you reduce the question to its absurd limit is to say, what happens if Trump comes back in 24? I mean, I don't think that's going to happen, but maybe a Trump-like figure or something. But the fact that we ask the question itself suggests to you the level of uncertainty and the absence of anybody who thinks it's their system and has a stake in running it. And you can see the other great powers, China, Russia, clearly don't want the system. In fact, they just said so. In Uzbekistan, when they met Putin and Xi, said, we will be great powers and show that we won't accept orders where other people tell us the rules. And we are going to show how responsible powers should behave. But there's no alternative that they've actually suggested. So we don't know where we're going. We don't have a system that works. And we have huge issues. So that's why I think we're in a world adrift, as it were.
Nitin, over to you.
Thanks, Latha. I mean, it's a privilege to be here on stage with two really very powerful scholars and policymakers. So I'm a dilettante in this game. So in the sense that I've been a person who worked on foreign policy from the outside. But if I have to frame an answer to your question, I think we are in an age of anxiety. Right? The anxiety comes from four broad directions, four broad trends. The first, as Ambassador Menon mentioned, is geopolitical. Right? If you look at the last 20 years, the post-World War II order was already fraying because it didn't allow emerging powers into the decision-making tables early enough. And you ended up with the P5 dominating it long beyond their sell-by date. Then you had China, which was really a tub-thumping power, very conscious of its civilizational identity, very conscious of its own view of what international relations should be, rising very fast and not adequately managed by the rest. And now you are in a situation where there's as Ambassador Menon put, it's adrift, there's a state of flux, things are up in the air. We don't know how the cards are going to land and how the new order will look like. So we don't have a foreign policy problem, we have a world order problem. And that's what we've got to solve. That's number one. The second is if you look at the geo-economic thing, which is linked to the geopolitical, but is important enough to be isolated out, is that we had a pattern, we had a playbook of geoeconomics, which meant that you do liberalization at home, you do greater trade with everybody else in the world on a multilateral basis. And because this conforms to trade theory and how trade works, it was prosperity for everyone. Almost everybody in the last 20 years, every country in the last 20 years became more prosperous, some more than the others, some unfairly, China being your classic example, which was an asymmetric globalization for China, where China benefited from other people opening up, but China's own opening up was very selective, very strategic. But even so, there was a playbook which said, okay, we open up, it's going to be good for us. But now you are in a situation where it's still good for us to open up, but then there are political forces which tell you that you should not have free trade, you should have import tariffs, you should block, you should do things at home and all of that. Despite many of us knowing what happens in a situation where an economy, closed economy, what kind of products and services it gives you, we are still heading back into that kind of thing, not just in India, but around the world. That's number two. Number three is the politics of the information age. Now, that's the big difference as compared to anything else we've seen in the past. In a matter of 25, 30 years, we've moved from the industrial age to the information age, which has created its own kind of politics. And these are the kind of politics which we viscerally feel and which trouble us on a daily basis, right? First is radically networked societies. People were able to mobilize online, engage in acts of terrorism, engage in acts of protests, engage in acts of all kinds of political mobilization that was earlier not easily doable, but something which the states and societies couldn't manage because they had no idiom for it, they didn't have machinery for it. Second, we have polarization on account of social media, where just the fact that the way the human brain reacts to information which comes 24/7 from a device in your pocket, it creates polarization. It creates ideological extremism. It creates identity-based politics. And it's not a surprise that around the world you have similar politics, right? I mean, the United States or India or China, Singapore, all of these countries seem to suffer from similar kinds of politics, right, in society. And the last is this business of information warfare, whether it's cyber warfare, which is the hacking of machines, or cognitive warfare, which is the hacking of minds. This is going on, right? So this is entirely new, and we have no mental models to deal with this. So that causes anxiety. And the fourth area which is giving us anxiety is things like climate change, right? And climate change and the response to it and the perceived responses to climate change creates levels of anxiety. You know, some people think that it doesn't exist and people are doing too much and they're anxious. Other people think that this is way too serious and, you know, we're going to, in the next 50 years, humanity will cease to exist and we're doing things too slow and they're anxious. There are other people who think that there are two types of people who are anxious and they're anxious about that, right? So it's layers of anxiety. So now when all of these four sources of anxiety come together, you feel not just that the world is adrift, but we as individuals are adrift in this world and we don't know how to, you know, what kind of decisions we ought to make. And that creates certain kinds of, you know, psychologies which prefer certain kinds of politics. We'll talk about it later. But I think this is where I want to end. You know, there are four big reasons why we are where we are.
I like the model you've described, Nitin, and you're right. We all feel a certain amount of anxiety. But to get back to the SCO, or Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, because, you know, we all diplomats have a bad habit of talking in alphabet soups. You know, there are so many acronyms. The SCO Summit, with our PM's participation, is taking place in Samarkand today. He reached yesterday and it's still ongoing. A grouping of India, China, Russia, Pakistan, and Iran, which will be joining this year, as well as Turkey, which is a guest state, may seem an odd choice for India. Suhasini Haidar had brought on an article where she talked about India being all aligned, meaning aligned to all groupings. And perhaps that's true because we belong to SCO, BIMSTEC, BRICS, G20, the Quad, East Asia Summit, ASEM. Sorry, I'm going into the alphabet soup again. And but, you know, is this all alignment? Is this multi-alignment? Is this strategic autonomy? What is it? And I'll put that question specifically with reference to the SCO to Ambassador Menon.
I think it's hard to find one word which describes what you're doing. When you see chaos around you, you end up reacting to situations and you end up also being opportunist, frankly. I mean, what you do today doesn't have to be coherent with what you're doing tomorrow or what you did yesterday. And in effect, that's what this world adrift, this world between orders, has forced many countries to do. If you look at, nobody today has a really clear explanation of, it was possible in the 50s to say India is non-aligned, and you knew what non-alignment meant. Or when Vajpayee said strategic autonomy, you knew what it meant. But you were dealing with a structured, ordered world. Today you're not. So I'm very nervous to put a label on it. But why are we in SEO? There is a basis for this. Because the US, the West is absent on the Eurasian landmass. Whether it's commercially, military, now they've pulled out of Afghanistan as well. They're just not there. We are the only member of the Quad who are both a continental and a maritime power. Quad is 3 islands because the US is an island in geopolitical terms. It has 2 of the world's biggest oceans and 2 harmless enemies. So, it can retreat when it wants to, it can interfere, offshore balance, as they call it. But we are the only ones who have a big continental problem. We have a land boundary dispute with China. We have to worry about what happens in Asia. And in order to manage that, who do you work with? You have to work with people who are there. Iran, Russia. Now, you might not like what's happening, Russia getting closer and closer. In fact, a China-Russia axis, which has been formed over the last few years. You might not like that, but the fact is you have to deal with that reality, or else you turn your back on Asia. But your future is here. This is your continent. You're a subcontinent. You're not a continent on your own. You're not an island who can run away from what's happening. And it affects your security every day. You've seen the consequences of what happens in Pakistan on your security. And you're an open subcontinent except for the Himalayas. And today technology has made even the Himalayas a battleground. So ultimately you will have to work with whatever's available. So there is a reason for your being in SEO. Now you might say that this is not going to lead very far. These people are not natural allies of yours. Their interests differ. Maybe, but maybe there is some overlap. You need to do that Venn diagram, see which bits you can work on together. And there are things like counterterrorism. There are other things where, frankly, your big threats are within the SEO. Cybersecurity is a good example of that, where you have a lot of trouble with other people in the SEO. But there are things where you will work together. So I think you might call this opportunistic, you might call it unprincipled, but that's the kind of world you're in. And I don't think you have much choice except to do this, to use each group the way you can, where you can, and further your interests with in whichever way you can.
Okay.
Nitin?
Yeah. So I have been a critic of the SEO. So let me just, I'm really pained and disappointed that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization does not have North Korea, Myanmar in it. Then it would have been complete. Right? Because it looks very incomplete. Right? And that suddenly we see we are the odd man out in this outfit. No, but more seriously, BRICS, SEO, and the Belt and Road Forum, which we skipped out. I think these are the kind of forums which, to me, were engagements which we got in at a time when we thought being engaged is better than being not engaged. Right? BRICS is this weird one where somebody found out that big economies with 8% growth rate. Okay, put these guys together and you create BRICS. I mean, it's absolutely absurd the worst way to form a international organization. SEO was really a Chinese Middle Kingdom effort to, at the first attempt to create a international bloc under Chinese leadership, bring people under Chinese leadership. And I don't think we ever accept Chinese leadership in Asia. I agree with Ambassador Menon in terms of our need to engage with the powers of Asia. But we could do this bilaterally. I mean, we probably do it, we get better results doing this bilaterally even now than with SEO. I'm not sure that the SEO is essential for this purpose. But what it does is it puts us in situations where our Prime Minister is in the league with all these wonderful guys. I really miss Kim Jong-un. I don't know whoever the Myanmar guy is. I don't like to see my prime minister in the company of these guys. I don't think we represent anything with those guys do. Not to mention the fact that we have a bleeding conflict with two of those guys. The other is, I don't think we've understood the costs of being in such places. The cost of being in SEO, for example, is this hurried arrangement in Ladakh. We had to create an artificial time. It says, the SEO, the leaders might want to meet. So the generals in the Indian Army were put under pressure that, okay, sort out something by the time, do something so that the Prime Minister can meet. Because the Prime Minister can't go to SEO and meet these guys if there's conflict open up. So you have to show something. And that cost of that agreement, I'm not sure really makes sense given the broader India-China equation, right? So why did we do this? So I think there are costs to these kind of things. And I mean, people can use words like all alignment. As an electrical engineer, it doesn't make sense to me. How can you be aligned to everything? I mean, no, it can't be done. I mean, I'm trying to think 2-3 dimensions. No, it's very hard. So we can use buzzwords like this to justify whatever we do. Maybe it sounds good. But I think that on a net basis, an SEO is a kind of a setup where we're better off not being a part of, just like how we avoided the Belt and Road Forum. And even now, even if you want to, now that you're in, and since we're talking about prospective things, now that you're in, I think a better way to deal with these things is to extract a price of our participation. Instead of paying entry fees, what are the prices? What price can we extract out of this? I don't think the Ladakh settlement is a price. I don't think it's a Chinese concession by any means. It's probably even Stevens or an Indian concession. It's not a Chinese concession. We haven't extracted a price for that participation. So what are we doing, right?
Well, that brings me to my next question, which is on China. That how do we perceive the challenges from China's rise and increasing assertiveness, and how do we in India respond to this challenge? What should we be doing?
But before I come to that, I want to add to what Nitin actually said about the costs you're paying.
Yes.
Because you're paying two other broader strategic costs by being in SEO and part of BRICS and doing what you used to do in a different context. It might have made sense then. Because of your stand on Ukraine, because of being part of this, being in Vostok, for instance, in these Russian exercises, I saw a Japanese saying, and then we said, no, but we didn't take part in the naval exercises off the Japanese coast. So I heard a Japanese official saying, so if we participate in Pakistani military exercises but don't take part in what they do in POK, how would you feel? And we are seeing signs, I think, where you can't have it every which way. You do end up, I mean, the US has just done a strategic materials initiative and didn't bother asking you. They did a Blue Pacific initiative, and strictly speaking, as part of Indo-Pacific Quad, you would expect to. You haven't been invited. These are subtle signs of trouble. They're not going to call you out in public because they do need you strategically and they do think you are useful because their primary contradiction is with China. But you need to rebalance, I mean, there's a whole host of organizations which I think in today's context probably don't make much sense for you. Why are we in the Commonwealth, I would say? I mean, so I think it's time to change what you did. I mean, we're back to Einstein's definition of madness, right? You're doing the same thing that you used to do and expecting the same result in a different situation. How does that work? So I think what Nitin says is right. It's time to actually fundamentally look at it and change it. And say, the world has changed, we're going to change. We don't have to be consistent in our foolishness forever. But on the China, and China is a big part of this, is central to this, because this is our biggest challenge, right? And over the last 40 years, we have allowed, where we were roughly similar size economies, we were probably more integrated in the world economy than they were, technological levels are also roughly similar. Now there's no comparison. Their economy is much bigger than ours. In terms of power, projection, what the Chinese can do, Chinese are global economic superpower. They're still only a regional military power. I mean, the US is the only power who can project military power across the world. But for us, that's no consolation because our periphery we actually share with the Chinese. And we are going to rub up against them. And we do have a difficult relationship with them. So dealing with the consequences of China's rise, first thing, we have to sort ourselves out. We have to start narrowing that gap in certain areas. It's not that you have to match China in every respect, but you have to at least maintain the effective balance on the border. If you don't do that, which you did for many years, you kept pace and you are now trying to catch up with the Chinese. But the reason they did what they did in 2020 and tried to change the situation on the ground and succeeded to a certain extent, maybe not to the extent they planned, was because they thought they had an opportunity. They thought the balance had shifted in their favor. So that's essential. You can do as much external balancing as you like, but other people are not going to fight your battles on the border. So I don't think that external balancing is the answer to your particular problem right now on the border. It is a broader answer. It's a broader answer to transforming India and making India strong and capable of dealing. And that's where you have a whole host of things you have to look at. Are you willing to engage economically with the rest of the world? You did best when were your high growth years? When you were most open to the world. And you then at one stage you were growing at 10.5% per year. But you're now down, back, and you're saying 7%, but on what? On a base that was terrible the year before. So we need to actually work with others to transform India. That's what it is. And if the Chinese see that happening and see the rest of the world taking you seriously, taking your future seriously, they will also behave differently. That's where, for me, the external balancing is important. You don't need to fight the Chinese everywhere. You cannot, and it's not worth it. But you have a whole set of opportunities today, I think, in order to actually step in and do something. I think the subcontinent is a huge opportunity. It's in crisis. 5 governments have changed in the last year, not all of them willingly. 3 countries are talking to the IMF about money. The Chinese can't do anything. The Sri Lankans have talked to them for 10 months, saying, please reschedule our debt. But the Chinese can't. They said, we'll refinance, meaning I'll give you another loan, so I'll add to your debt. But if they reschedule with Sri Lanka, they have to reschedule with the rest of BRI. That's almost $1 trillion. Because everybody else will come saying, what about us? So here you have a moment where you can actually use the crisis to integrate the subcontinent, build payment systems. After all, you've spent $3.8 billion this year on Sri Lanka, fuel, food, credits. Use it. Create stakes in the relationship with the other rest of the... For me, crisis is an opportunity. All the things we said about are wrong with the system, here's your opportunity. Go out and change the situation because there's space for you to operate. Pakistan. Why is the whole ceasefire with Pakistan holding for the last year when we renewed the 2003 ceasefire? Because Pakistan has other problems to worry about. She has no money, she's in political crisis, and she has to worry about the TTP, who are re-energized by the Taliban coming to power in Afghanistan. She's bombing the TTP in Afghanistan in the last few months. So, the Pakistan army right now keeps the ceasefire. So frankly, things look chaotic, look terrible, but I think we need to use this opportunity to create levers and things which will change the Chinese perception of this inevitable gap growing between us. And the only way to do that, because the Chinese operate on the relative balance of power. And you can see it. They were faithful camp followers of the US until 2008, until the global financial crisis. Anything the US did was fine by them. They never got in the way. After 2008, suddenly they've grown ideas. And they're busy asserting themselves in the neighborhood, everywhere else. So it's the relative balance of power, and unless we address that, both immediately on the border as the effective balance, but also in the broader sense, and their perception of it, that's very important. If they see you as a divided country which is fighting itself, which is alienating 12% of its own population, they will treat you a certain way.
Nitin, thoughts on China?
Well, yeah, I can't put it better than what he has done. But I just want to just make one point, and I've been making this. In fact, I was just thinking through this. The first time I made this point was at the BIC in 2010. And that's got to do with a very simple thing that we are better off shifting the locus of the India-China rivalry from the Himalayas to the Pacific. Because if the rivalry plays out in the Himalayas, we find ourselves in very contentious, very tenuous, very dangerous grounds. Because, let's say the Chinese were to walk in and take a village or two in Ladakh, and this plays out in the media. It puts the political leadership in a position, in a very tricky position. And the political leadership will have to react, invest more in fighting in the hills. And, when your armies are literally looking and touching each other, lots of things can happen. You don't want these kind of rivalries to play out where the armed forces are eye to eye, or literally more than eye to eye, right? So shift this to the Pacific in various ways. You shift this in the economic domain. You shift this in the pure balance of power domain. You shift this even in the military domain, in the maritime domain. I think that's the opportunity which was there for the last 10 to 12 years, and now it's become even more interesting because of the intensification of the military crises, multiple military crises which China has created in the East Asian, anything east of the Straits of Malacca, right? Whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's in Taiwan Straits, whether it's in the off the coast of Japan, or even in the Pacific itself. Now this is risky. Okay, it's become much more risky now than it was 10 years ago, in terms of sheer conflict or breaking out between China and one of its adversaries there. But we don't have to participate in conflicts. We just have to be there, and we just have to signal our ability to shift the conflict in ways that are detrimental to one player or the other, whether it's the United States or whether it's China. Your presence and your action can change the calculation which the main players there have, and that gives us leverage. And that also, I argue, and I've always argued this, that also helps us deter the Chinese from doing funny things in the Himalayas. Because if you can signal to him that I can mess with you where it hurts you, then he's unlikely to mess with you where it hurts you. So that's the kind of thing. I think there's an opportunity now, but it's also a much more riskier time to avail of that opportunity.
Thanks, Nitin. That's an interesting point of view about shifting the locus to the Pacific. I wanted to now go to another issue altogether, but one which is very, very topical and very much in all our minds. And that is, how do we see the conflict triggered by the Russian invasion into Ukraine heading? And how will it be resolved? And I know it's not politically correct at the moment in India to talk about the invasion, but I do see it as an invasion. So, Ambassador Menon, you first. Yeah.
Well, you're absolutely right. I've never understood why we don't call it an invasion. It is an invasion, and it's a question of your own credibility, actually. And frankly, for me, the logical attitude right from the beginning, from February 24th, would have been an invasion is silly because it's not going to solve the problem. There's no military solution to this. So are economic sanctions, because they're not going to solve the problem either. And there has to be a better way. And the best way is around a table where you reconcile your interests and you accommodate the legitimate interests that all sides have in this. But of course, those days are long gone. So what is it now? It's now a fight between Europeans for the European order. And there is no European order left, and they're both trying to create an order of their own. So whoever wins or loses, frankly, Europe is going to be in turmoil for a while. And even if nobody wins, I mean, that's the worst, of course, and many people think that's the most likely outcome. But let's say Russia wins. You think NATO and the US and the Ukrainians will let them live in peace? No. I mean, if the Ukraine wins, you think an angry, revengeful Russia looking to actually overthrow whatever results, is going to let Europe live in peace. So Europe is going to be preoccupied with Europe for a long time to come. I mean, all this talk of Europe is coming into the Indo-Pacific and so on. My worry is that the US will also continue to be distracted. I mean, they've been talking about rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific, then Indo-Pacific for the last 20 years. But they have never done it. Either Afghanistan, then Iraq, then something or the other, now Ukraine. So if you look at the actual commitment to the Indo-Pacific, it's limited. And they've managed to push the Russians into Chinese arms. You can blame whoever you want for this whole process, because you can take it back to NATO membership, or you can take it back further. You can take it to, Russian actions have not been that sensible or productive. But whoever you want to blame, the net result is you now have a China-Russia axis. We have to worry. I mean, at the rate they're going with Western sanctions, Russian weapons and platforms are going to have Chinese chips in them, because there won't be any others available to the Russians. Is that what we want? And do we want to see Russia as a junior partner? Even if Russia is very reluctant and doesn't like the idea and has historical reasons to distrust it. But what options does Russia, with a declining population, and ultimately these sanctions are going to mean a declining economy as well. It might survive for today and tomorrow. But so for me, the consequences, apart from the second order consequences like high food prices, high energy prices, all of which are not very good for us. But apart from that, for me, the longer term political effects of what's happening are worrying for us. But there isn't much that we can do about this. It's interesting that Putin said in public to Xi Jinping that we understand your concerns and questions and will answer them tomorrow, meaning in the SEO meeting. So I actually think it's even worse for China than it is for us in many ways, because they've got themselves tied after declaring their partnership without limits on February 4th. I think they really have a problem. And frankly, for them, the land part of BRI, the goal was to reach Europe. I mean, how do they go? Without Ukraine, without Russia? They have one railway line which will find its way through Poland maybe, but BRI, I think it's knocked it for a 6. But quite apart from the political pressure that now you have a united West, China seems to have lost Europe. They had a comprehensive agreement on investment and trade, which has not been ratified, and after this is very unlikely to be. So there's a whole set of other consequences also, which, for me, these are difficult. Now, for us, there's also opportunities. On the energy side, there's a remaking of the world. I mean, you might actually end up at the end of this with one global gas market, which you've never had, unlike oil. I don't know where it's going, but we are fishing in troubled waters. We're getting cheap oil from the Russians, and let's see. But that's tactical opportunism. The larger political, strategic consequences, I'm afraid, are not very good.
Nitin, you and I were at the Pune International Center where we discussed, or Pune International Center, I should say, where we discussed Russia and Ukraine in some detail. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Latha. I think the first thing which comes to my mind is then when you don't have a dog in the fight, all you need to do is to ensure that you're on the winning side. Right? It doesn't really matter who wins, but we should make sure that whenever this conflict comes to a certain kind of a end, we are on the side which is more advantageous, which has got the upper hand. One way to look at it is to see where your trading partners, your most important trading partners are, which side of the conflict they've taken. We did an analysis. And 90-something% of our trading partners, the way they voted in the United Nations, are against the Russians. In a sense, calling it an invasion is just the smallest of those things. They've actually condemned it. So if you're looking at where our interests lie, because our trading partners are important to us, and in sanctions regimes, etc., especially when it goes to more complicated ones into technology, supply chains, and all that, you just want to be in a place where you can trade with your partners. That's the winning side. And you have to make sure that you're on that side and you're not cut out of that, right? And that, I think, is a strategic objective we should be looking at beyond cheap oil. And as Ambassador Menon said, these are very tactical, opportunistic things that you do because you have that room to play and you make the best out of it. But if you look at where do we want to go, it's really to make sure that when this thing settles down, we are in a better position than if we are on the wrong side, right? The second thing which strikes me and impresses me about this conflict is what it means in the court of information warfare, right? Before the conflict, everybody was saying that the Russians have a formidable information warfare machine. There's this Gerasimov doctrine where they've integrated information warfare, propaganda, psychological operations, military operations together, and it's the best in the world and all of that, right? And a lot of us who studied this were sort of impressed by that. But the first thing which struck you is the fact that tanks had to move in to Ukraine implies that information warfare failed. Your propaganda couldn't win even people who are culturally very similar to you. The Ukrainians, more or less, they are in the same cultural space as the Russians. You couldn't impress the Ukrainians enough to join the Russians. So you had to send tanks. So at that one level, it shows the limits of what a closed authoritarian state can do in terms of information warfare. Your limits of your soft power, your cultural power, do not even extend to your immediate neighbors, number one. The two is, if you look at what Ukraine did, it's almost got global sympathy and support. People who didn't know what Ukraine was on the map in the beginning of this year are flying Ukrainian flags on their rooftops, right? They have Ukrainian icons on their social media handles and so on. And how did this happen? And it's not just sympathy and publicity, right? It's also material support. The number of countries which have just come out of the blue and started providing military assistance, financial assistance, technical assistance, and all kinds of things, individuals also walking in and joining the Ukrainian struggle is just amazing. And this is for a bunch of people who are probably unknown to the rest of the world. I mean, most of the rest of the world before February 2022. So how did they pull that off? I think there are things to learn there, No, for sure, the United States spent almost the whole of last year helping the Ukrainians prepare, both in the information domain, cyber domain, and in hard military domain. There's no doubt about that. The Europeans and the Americans have helped them a lot. But even so, how do you end up in a situation where you're the darling of the world, despite being so small? And how, if you're Russia, how do you end up in a situation where you're seen as the villain of the peace? At least in public domain, right? So there are lessons to be learned. There's things you should do, things you should not do.
It's interesting, but I want to bring in one other point, that I think the race question is very important here because, you saw the comments that came in when Ukraine was invaded, the outcry from the West, particularly from Europe, and even from American commentators was, these are people like us, they're blonde and blue-eyed people who are fleeing as refugees. I mean, in a way, it's a deeply racist comment to say that somehow people who belong to the same race as the predominant numbers in Europe and the US are entitled to better treatment as refugees than refugees from, let's say, our part of the world, or Syria or Iran or anywhere else. So I think that is an element which we have to keep in mind. Perhaps that's played a role in why they are the darling of the world.
Yeah, but I'm in no position to comment because if you look at intake of refugees, Europeans and Americans have taken a lot more refugees from around the world than we have.
True, that's
right?
true.
So
yeah,
I don't think I have. I don't have a moral standing to comment on the Europeans because if you are racist after taking so many refugees,
Yeah.
it's one thing. But if you just say, I'm not going to take refugees,
Yeah.
that's entirely other, right? That's
But
what
I
we're
think
doing.
also, I think you need to compare with how in 1971, despite
Yes.
the world's big propaganda machines being against us, we did manage to get world opinion on our side. 10 million refugees, the underdog, that image. I think that really works across the world.
Maybe the underdog
Yeah.
question, you mean?
Yeah. But also, I think there's a lot of military lessons to be learned here out of what's going on. I mean, you don't get to eliminate 5 Russian generals unless your intelligence is perfect, that you can pinpoint where they are, unless they're stupid enough to use their mobile phones, which maybe they were, but but you never know. I mean, but also, if I were Chinese, I'd be very worried. Look at the performance of conscript armies. I mean, it tells you something about if you have people for 3 years, short-term conscripts, how much can you train them? And how much cohesion can you build into your units? How useful are they in this kind of warfare, where technology, where intelligence plays such a big role? It's a new kind of war, actually.
Yeah. There's just one thing from the Pune thing which I want to add.
Yeah.
It's a point which was made by Ajay Shah, who's very sharp in terms of, I think he's the sharpest cookie when it comes to looking at the impact of these geoeconomics. What he says is this: after the war in Ukraine ends, there's so many things that are broken, right? I mean, we've literally destroyed so much of infrastructure in Ukraine, and the Europeans will want to rebuild that, and you need close to $1 trillion. I can't remember the number. Close to $1 trillion in real investment to rebuild Ukraine or the places that have been broken, which means a whole lot of global capital will go into financing Ukrainian rebuilding, which means the cost of capital for people like us will increase. Even if you want to build bridges and infrastructure, etc., the cost of capital will increase. So that's his analysis. I don't have the numbers, but I think that's something we have to be concerned about in a way that the second order effect of that crisis might translate into higher infrastructure costs, capital costs for us.
Yeah.
Also, it's probably bought Taiwan another 5 years at least.
That's a point. I want to talk now about India's foreign policy. Do you see a more assertive Indian foreign policy today? One commentator has talked about the saffronization of the Indian Foreign Service. I'd particularly like to hear your views on that.
Me or Nitin?
Well, both of you. and and what has this meant for India's international relations? And how does the West, especially the US, see us in this context, this new foreign policy? This
I think we're
assertive
certainly
foreign policy?
presenting ourselves as much more assertive.
Yeah.
But that's partly because I think foreign policy today is also aimed at the domestic audience to a much greater extent than it used to be in the past. It's part of the democratization of foreign policy, I suppose. Also, social media, technology has changed. Otherwise, foreign policy used to be the private business of a small little establishment that did it in secret and was very proud of themselves and, got away with it. But that's no longer possible. And so now, actually, politicians use foreign policy to consolidate the base, to play to their followers' prejudices and so on. And therefore, you get this much more assertive expression of foreign policy and a lot more talking about, look what we're doing, look at me, look at me. It's, are we actually more adventurous in practice? You still have to convince me of that, because it seems to me that in actual fact, you've become pretty risk averse. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in the situation you're on in the border with China. You're not seizing opportunities that I see, as I said, in the neighborhood with Pakistan. And certainly you've run away from economic opportunities like RCEP, like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, where you're saying, I won't do the trade leg. And, you're hedging both ways. You give with PLI and take away with higher tariffs. So one hand you're giving, the other hand you're taking. This, for me, is not an adventurous or the kind of policy changes that you need. You started down military reform, appointed a CDS, started talking of theaterization, jointness, and so on. But now 9 months, the last CDS passed on, and suddenly it's all seemed to have come to a stop. I mean, accountancy seems to determine defense decisions rather than, objective needs. So for me, I'm not sure that you can speak. When I say foreign policy, for me, foreign policy is much broader than just diplomatic meetings and summit meetings of leaders. If foreign policy is the business of creating outcomes which serve your interests and furthering your interests, then I'm not sure that I'd say we are more assertive today or not. Whether you call it saffronization or whatever, I've always been against the idea that you politicize the making of foreign policy. And I mean, the professionals need to stay professional and give you honest advice. They need to tell you the bad news. That's the job. We're paid to tell the leaders the bad news. Privately, quietly, without embarrassing, saying, I told the old fool. But, you need to do this, but it needs to be done, and you need to protect people. So if you get into a situation of groupthink, of saffronization, where leaders hear what they want to hear, and there's enough people in a political system, in a bureaucracy, who are willing to tell leaders what they think they want to hear. But a good leader knows the difference and knows that he needs honest advice. And that's why the professionalization is important. I mean, whether they're saffronized or whether they're communist or Marxist or whatever, frankly, that's a personal choice of their own. But it shouldn't enter into their professional life because it affects your efficiency.
Nitin, thoughts on foreign policy and where it's going?
See, assertiveness in style, I sort of agree.
Yeah.
There is definitely an assertiveness, then an attempt to, show that, you're assertive, you're on the front foot, you're ready to give as much as you get or even more than you get. So in terms of style and a combative kind of a style. In terms of substance, whereas I would think there is assertiveness is in promoting or refloating the Quad as a countervailing coalition to China's rise. Maybe not to the extent that a person like me, I would have liked. I don't think it's as powerful as assertive as I would have wanted it to be. Yeah. But okay, it's assertive relative to what my fears were. On the saffronization, I think any public official in a democracy is cut of the same cloth as the rest of the population.
That's right.
He or she will have the same prejudices, biases, aspirations, fears as anybody else. And to the extent that the UPSC has been largely successful in widening the base from which it picks people, you will see these characteristics in the government service as well, and even the armed forces. It's not that anybody is immune from that. So that in itself is not so much a comment on the foreign service or the public services as much as comment on overall society as well. But I totally agree with Ambassador Menon on the professionalism. You could be left-wing, right-wing, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, really doesn't matter. As long as professionally you're doing what you're supposed to do and you're doing it to the best of your ability, you're being absolutely consistent with your responsibilities to the Constitution and your responsibilities to the political leadership in terms of giving them accurate feedback about what it is. Maybe sometimes it might help if you're a saffronized person and the political leadership has greater comfort with you because they see that politically you're on the same side. So if you are a pro-BJP bureaucrat and you have the confidence of the Prime Minister and the leadership, and you are able to be truthful and forthright, I think it's a good thing.
Well, I think we should open it up perhaps for interaction with the audience at this point. And of course, if we've answered all your questions and you have nothing to ask us, we'll happily keep chatting among ourselves. But I do hope there'll be some questions. There's a mic up here, so you'd have to come up and address your question. I'm sorry, but we don't have circulating mics anymore. Yes, please go ahead.
Can you get this up? Okay, no problem. Yeah, good evening. Thank you for your, sorry, I can help it. Good discussion and stimulating thoughts on this. I have one or two comments and then one final question. One is duality is natural in nature. So we need to find a counterweight to the US-Europe. Unless till that gets settled, we will not have comfort. We have US and Russia or USSR, that's gone. So the earlier I feel China, Russia get aligned and that counterweighted by US and Europe, we become more clarity and thought process can be better. So that has to happen. So it could be the English-speaking world versus the non-English-speaking world. That could be the, the dividing line. Okay, second, SEO, Nitin talked about why India is there. I think India is there consciously to show the rest of the participants there that China is not the only force. We are also there. I think that's the purpose, to my mind, why we are there. Third, on Russia, I think leadership change in Russia is the solution. Till that happens, this issue may not solve. So my question finally is this. The globalization has been taunted as the panacea for the world economy problems, social upliftment, all of that. It served a purpose. But do you think that that has led to the right-wing political rise across the world? Thank you.
Well, who'd like to take this? Come, Nitin. You.
Well,
Yeah.
well, first of all, I don't agree that duality is anything in nature. And examples from nature might not necessarily translate equal to international relations. So you could have a triangular balance of power, you could have a quadrilateral balance of power, you could have a pentilateral, you could have a huge number of people very balanced in the Rajamandala. For example, if you look at the Kautilian theory, where there are multiple principalities or kingdoms in a mandala, you can have various ways that they are balanced. There's not one or two. So this idea that you have to balance the West by creating something with all sorts of shady characters in the East is, I don't buy it. And as far as balancing the Anglophone goes, the language we are speaking here is English. India is an Anglophone country. At least the part of India that is engaged in globalization is an Anglophone India. This city is successful because of English, right? There was a very interesting advertisement which came out. It says, it was on Twitter. I have a screenshot of it. It says, live in Bangalore and enjoy dollar salary, English proficiency required. Right? That's how we've become prosperous. So I don't want to bring down the Anglophone world. Good luck. Let English live long and let us prosper on that Anglophone thing. How do you get rid of Putin? I don't know. but let me put it this way. I wouldn't want to make those kind of comments also. We just don't know how things will go when you take one player out of the system. It's nice to believe that probably it'll be better for us, but I don't know. So I'm just being humble on that part. But on the other parts, I think we are better off in a situation where the entity that is our biggest challenge to our developmental process, which is the People's Republic of China, is balanced by somebody else. Our interests are not with the Chinese, to the extent that, if the Chinese were okay with us growing, the Chinese were okay with us having our own space to grow on our own terms, we would have been fine. But they're not. And they've told you over the last 25 years, they are not. They will take every single opportunity to pin you down and keep you locked into the subcontinent and shrink your space in the subcontinent. How can you be on good terms with these kind of guys? As I said, I'm an electrical engineer. I'm not a great thinker in terms of international relations, but it seems to me that your enemy's enemy is your friend, and your enemy is not your friend. basic stuff.
Just to add to that, there's been a debate in international relations theory for the last 70 years, actually, about what's more stable, a bipolar system, a multipolar system, or a system which has two or three competing sort of alliance structures, and a Cautillian world where you have, a mixture of city-states, confederation, kingdoms, empires, etc. And there is no conclusive answer. There's no empirical answer, if you look at history and look at the record, and there's also no theoretical answer to that. So I'd be a little careful about being too categorical about, duality or any of these. When people say multipolarity is wonderful, it tends to be quite unstable. And it's actually quite a messy world when it gets multipolar. But multipolarity has become the buzzword today, right? Everybody says, oh, multipolar, wonderful, because we think we are one of the poles. But on the China thing, I think China is the only great power that opposes India's rise and has made it absolutely clear. And so for me, it's a no-brainer. You need to work with those who are preventing or trying to contain the rise of China or its bad effects. And today, China-US contention is structural, both on the Chinese side and on the US side. On the US side, it's the only issue which has bipartisan consensus, which makes you wonder about groupthink. And it makes you a little nervous. But anyway, the fact is it's there. And on the Chinese side, it's now become part of official rhetoric at the highest level. You hear it from Xi Jinping, you hear it across the board, and it's going to be consecrated, I think, again, that the West is against us, the US is trying to contain China's rise, and we have to fight this. We have to therefore do things ourselves. And so, since it's structural, use it. Use it for your benefit. And that's where I think, so what Nitin says, I think is absolutely right.
What? Yes.
The issue of globalization, has it caused right-wing political rise?
Can we just take the people who are waiting in line, please? And could you come up to the...
Ask this. Let me just respond
Sorry.
because you had asked this. Yeah, sorry, I missed that question.
Yeah.
Well, partly yes, okay? Partly yes, because it has changed the returns to capital versus labor. It has changed the returns to knowledge versus labor, right? So what globalization did really is those who had more capital and those who had more knowledge in terms of knowledge industries benefited a lot more from globalization processes than the people who just had labor to give, which is why you had, you still have problems in the West, in different parts of the world. The other way it enabled this was a second order effect, because globalization allowed the internet, for example, to proliferate around the world very, very quickly on the same terms as it was in the US and others, which then led to growth of social media, and then it had psychological consequences. These were not intended, but they've ended up promoting both extreme right-wing and also extreme left-wing. So what's pushed is it's pushed the political discourse to both extremes. So you have people very strong. I was thinking of a word for it, and I think it is time that we start using the word progressive fascism, because there are, coercive progressives, where you have to be progressive. If you're not progressive, then you are, cancelled or something like that, So that is also happening at the other side. Although the right wing gets a lot more of attention because it's in power in most places, and the left wing is mostly at the fringes of power and is a dissenting voice, but it's also very, very, very regimented and very, out to silence you if you don't comply to the dogma of which they hold.
You're okay with that answer? Okay. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, my name is Alok. Thanks for this talk, wonderful. I'm here, as Nitin said, one of those anxious people who are here for climate. And sort of just curious, in a world that is so disarrayed, where cooperation and conversations even about climate, which is a sort of unifying, which should be a unifying thing where everybody should agree and sort of make progress on, and China is sort of withdrawn from having conversations about it. And then you have these organizations like Greenpeace who are neither green nor for peace. They're shutting down nuclear plants and starting up oil refineries, and then then you have Russia going in and using that money. And then similar conservatism in India, which is sort of blocking sort of even renewable deployment and a whole bunch of other things. What do you see as a pathway for the world actually uniting? In the long arc of history, COVID and Russian invasion and all of these things are going to be blips, but climate change is something that is sort of here to stay, and that's the challenge for the century and for many generations to come. And we are completely lost, the focus on this issue as a society and as sort of humanity at large.
Climate change?
Well, I don't think the record since 1992, since Rio, suggests that international negotiations are the way forward. Because every country has used it to basically further their own energy interests or their own economic interests. And today you've got to a situation where the world is just unable to agree, even though it's obviously the challenge of the future, it affects us all. I mean, look at Paris. What did we agree? That each country will set its own targets, but that nobody else has the right to even check on whether you're keeping up to it. This is an agreement? I mean, on what? And yet we're so happy. Oh, look, we did Paris. And I mean, for me, it is inconceivable that this whole process of COPs, and that train is frankly on its own track, but it's not going to solve the problem. So in which case you can only hope that people who are affected by it start dealing with it at some micro level or some level between the micro and the macro. You look at what China's done actually, and they started doing it because it started affecting the legitimacy of the regime itself, of the Communist Party. And they've done a great deal to clean up their own environment. If you look at where they were, I mean, I remember Beijing, you had red sunrises and red sunsets every day of the year 20 years ago. Today, that's not the case at all. They still have huge problems with water, with soil, but they have managed to do something. We, frankly, have not done very much. Until you're choking, then suddenly you say CNG for all Delhi buses. And you manage to clean up the atmosphere sufficient for about 10 years. Now again, you're back in trouble. And now you're trying to work out a solution. You can't go to the courts, but now you have AAP governments in both Delhi and Punjab, and you're hoping that will at least. So ultimately, it's going to break down to individual actions at various other levels, and to citizens taking their future into their own hands. I don't see the international processes making it easier. And this kind of world that we are describing, it doesn't help.
Sorry to interject, but the writing on the wall is pretty clear in terms of Pakistan being completely drowning and China being in the middle of this.
But don't forget, the writing on the wall is clear to you and me.
No,
but there is a whole lot of people who don't want to read it, who deny it.
No, actually, I would take the opposite view. I would reassure you, okay? And I'll tell you why. I think there is a whole lot of anxiety with the pace at which we are changing, because I think the general consensus among most people, especially people who are, let's say, younger than age of 30, younger than 30, the consensus seems to be that, look, things are not moving fast enough. The climate will get us before we fix this, right? And that sense of lack of speed animates your thinking, makes you more anxious, makes you more, let's go and do things, which is not a bad thing because it creates impetus for change. But look at it in terms of historic, from a historic timescale point of view. As recently as 2007, the jury was still out on whether climate change is anthropogenic or not. Right? That's what, 15 years ago? 12 years ago, as recently as 12 years ago, most people in policy making capacities around the world were still wondering whether A, there is climate change, is it real? And B, whether it's humans are causing it. Today in 2022, other than a few wonderful people in the United States who have a wonderful red cap, but other than those kind of guys, almost everybody, you won't find a normal person who's considered sane who will deny this, right? Climate change is happening, humans are doing this. Now, whatever be the scientific evidence behind it, that's another story. But the general global consensus is that there is this problem, right? Second, very few people, including countries like India, deny that something has to be done about it. Everybody agrees that action has to be taken. How fast, how much, all of that is matter for debate, but everybody agrees that is the case. 12 years, okay? Just look at it. All of this is 200 countries in the United Nations who can't even agree on what kind of a plug point to have, electrical plug point. We've spent 200 years since electricity came in. We don't even have a common plug point, right? But we are agreeing on something as complex as climate change. Now, here's the thing. In most countries, you might have right-wing leaders who deny climate change or deny the need to do climate change. You have a right-wing prime minister in India who is in favor of doing things to protect the environment. I mean, people like me had to raise our hands and say, don't ban single-use plastics abruptly because it has social consequences you haven't thought of, right? So you have a situation in India where you have to actually put the brakes on the prime minister and say, go easy on green. Go easy because it has other consequences. You have to pace yourself, right? So all of these things, I think, are changes when seen from a historic time scale in terms of how global consensus on matters arises. It's a positive. As an engineer, and you should read Václav Smil if you've not read Václav Smil. Václav Smil is the most insightful thinker in terms of energy transition. It is extremely difficult for human society to make an energy transition to the kind that we need. Even if we all, decide tomorrow morning, it's very difficult to do it in less than 20, 30 years. Okay? So it is going to take that much of time. But the good news is that we are heading in that direction, right? So those of you who are anxious and want to use your anxiety to ask questions like this and push people in that direction, please continue to do so. More power to you. But also keep in the back of your mind that, look, we are actually getting there. We might not get there at a pace that will avert that crisis. Bangalore is still going to be flooded. Maybe it's not because of climate change, because of what we did to the city. But because Bangalore floods have affected us here and now, we are going to do things that, and I'm positive we'll do things. We'll do things in our own, I don't want to use that half-dash whatever way. We'll do this in a half-dash way, which will get us somewhere in that direction. But in so doing, we'll also do things which will help us in the climate fight. I think that's the way this fight is going to be fought, not in terms of a grand bargain where, the leaders of the world come together and sign one thing and, lo and behold, everything will be sorted out.
Thanks. Amit, and then I think there was another gentleman waiting, Amit, if you don't mind. I think perhaps we could have him first. Yeah.
Do you really think that the current political establishment is turning foreign policy into an election subject? And is that a good or a bad thing? Second question, what do you really think of Atmanirbhar Bharat? Can we really be Atmanirbhar ever?
See, I think I'm perfectly okay with foreign policy being an electoral subject. I'm perfectly okay. Judge the lead. I mean, because foreign policy is as important to a politics as, let's say, water supply is, right? Because all of these are dimensions on which you want to judge your political leadership. And what I would expect is a far more accurate reading of the situation from the media. You want the feedback which a citizen gets in terms of the performance of our leadership on foreign policy. I think that has to be far more objective, far more clear, far more transparent. And if I have to ask for a blessing in this, I would ask for that. I would ask for a media that is ruthless in terms of its pursuit of facts and presenting it to the citizens. Your other question of Atmanirbhar, no, you can never be Atmanirbhar. There is no country on earth that is Atmanirbhar. United States of America with a per capita income of $65,000 is not Atmanirbhar. It's not. it does its outsourcing of office services in India. It buys semiconductors from Taiwan, and it buys rare materials from other places. It gets Mexican from Mexico, right? So there's no way any country can be Atmanirbhar. So as a slogan, as an inspirational slogan which promotes local entrepreneurship, local industry, triggers investment into industries which might not otherwise have come, I think the campaign is good. But if you take that and make that into a dogma, which says, I don't know, even that pen and this water bottle and this slipper has to be made in India, that's going to lead us to ruin, right? So,
Too many cooks don't spoil the broth in national foreign policy.
we have, he was a cook, so he should know. He was a chef. He was a chef. There was a master chef. You ask him that question.
No, I don't. Actually, it's good. But as he said, it should be based on an informed discussion and knowledge of what's going on, right? And unfortunately, we haven't made that transition yet. But it's getting better. I mean, more and more people are interested, and more people know much more about the world. Today, whether you like it or not, you are part of a global world. You're part of the global economy. You're linked. I mean, you watch movies, you get news. You are globalized in a way that no previous generations were. I mean, by 2014, something like 49.6% of your GDP was imports and exports was merchandise trade. I mean, and you add services, remittances, you're above 50%. It's gone back down since. I mean, now merchandise trade is somewhere around 33, 34% of GDP. But that's a huge chunk. That's 1/3 of your GDP. You are part of the world, whether you like it or not. So let's talk about how we deal with this world, how we engage with it. Do we walk out of RCEP? That shouldn't be just a decision by 3 politicians. It should be something we should all discuss. It affects us all. So I'm quite happy with it being democratized, actually.
Amit, over to you.
First of all, thank you very much for a very rich and interesting discussion on foreign policy and the challenges that we face. But while we were talking about a world adrift, it did come to my mind that yes, we had a rule book that we followed for a while from 1945. The war had ended. Soviet Union and the United States formed their own alliances, and we moved on with that for about another 35 years or 40 years, and then the Soviet Union faded away, and you had a brief interregnum of 20 years. But if you look forward, there is an economic, inexorable thrust going forward. And one of the first thrusts, which I think that the whole world, when you talk about anxiety, and I'm leading up to my question, is that at some point, China will overtake the United States even normally in terms of GDP. It has already done that in purchasing power parity, and we are the third. So the part which I look at now, and I'm asking the question, that if you took a longer framework, would you really blame the Chinese? Because I would give the Chinese another 50 years. But after 50 years, you may find that India, with its growing population, like China has already reached peak population, its GDP is now dependent only on productivity, which is a damn difficult thing to drive. So China is going to grow at 3 or 4% going forward. India happily can grow to 6 with a potential of 8, and we will continue with this at least till 100 years of past independence. So the part that you really look at is we now have 3 players. The West, represented by the United States, Europe in decline with an aging population, India on the rise with 1/6 of the world's population, China having risen and in 10 years will have challenged the world and will be at its pinnacle point. But the real thing which I'm talking about, the inexorability, is the shift to Asia, and we do not have the mechanisms, modalities, and all of it to deal with this Asian century. So that is where I'm looking at, and I'm saying, yes, we are adrift, but we know that the boat and the ships are moving in a particular direction. So where does this lead us? And that's where the question that I'd like to pose to all 3 of you. Thank you.
Let me try a bit of this, and then maybe you can do the other bits, because that's really the core of the question. I mean, where are we going? For me, there's the two big moving parts in there which add to our uncertainty. One is China's trajectory. China's productivity in the Chinese economy has not grown since the mid-90s, actually, which is why they've been driven, even though they've been talking about shifting to consumption, to domestic consumption in order to run and moving away from this investment-led growth. At every stage when they face crisis, they've gone back to investment, which has increased debt. And so China today, I mean, some estimates say they're actually growing at about 2.5%, maybe 3.5 is a better estimate. But it seems to me that China is at the stage where all the miracle economies after 30, 40 years of fantastic growth went through very difficult adjustment periods, much harder than they expected. You saw it with Japan, you saw it in Taiwan, you saw it in Korea. Singapore was the only one which actually figured it out and managed to handle it better, I think, than the others. And I think China's at that stage. Now, when does China peak? You seem to expect it 10 years from now. There are other people who say China has already peaked, which is why Xi Jinping from April last year has been talking about a completely new economic approach, common prosperity, dealing with, why do you deal with inequality? Because frankly, putting money into the hands of the rich, they're going to save or invest. It's only if you put it in the hands of the poor that they'll actually consume. So if you want to boost demand and consumption, you need to, that's the way he sees it at least. So China's already going through that adjustment. Now, if you think it's going to peak after 10 years, then you're talking about one kind of world. If you think they've already peaked and that one reason for their assertiveness and much of what they've been doing is because they're in a hurry, because they know their demography is against them. And frankly, the one-child policy now looks like a huge disaster. I mean, this is the trouble with China. They succeed spectacularly, but they also fail spectacularly. Great leap forward, cultural revolution, one-child policy. I would add BRI to that, actually, as an overcommitment. You can list this, but they have huge successes at the same time. Look at what they've done for poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So it really depends what you think China's trajectory is going to be. And when you think China would have peaked and when that adjustment kicks in. And it seems to me all the signs today, whether it's debt to 75% of GDP, whether it's the real estate crisis, which they can handle because they have the means, but then what happens to everybody's savings? When 70% of your people's savings is really in flats and real estate because you're not getting money in the bank. And how do you, but because you can't stop employment, do you just keep increasing the debt? I mean, they have a real problem. And so for me, that's one big variable. The other big variable, of course, is the extent to which other economies like India, like now Japan and so on, actually can step in and provide the engines of growth in the world economy. I'm not sure. Today it's hard to see. Because if we are going to do Atmanirbharta and cut ourselves off, raise tariffs, etc., then you're not doing the things that will help you, but also help the world economy. And if you're in for a long period of slow growth, then much of what you said actually becomes self-reinforcing. You'll get worse politics, you'll get more self-reliance in China, you'll get more the US going home. You'll get a world which is actually shrunken both mentally, economically, politically also. And that's a very different prospect from what, otherwise. I don't believe either of them are right when they tell you, oh, the arc of history is bending towards democracy, or when they say the East is rising and the West is declining and this is inevitable. I don't believe either of them. None of these predictions have ever been right in the past. You can't straight line extrapolate from today. So I would only say, pick your markers, which things you think are important, watch those very carefully, and keep adjusting as you go along. I mean, what Dunn said, feel the stones underfoot as you cross the river.
Yeah, I just want to make a very quick one. I don't think the story of the United States declining is true. I mean, even today, knowing all the problems they are in, where do the smartest people of the world go to? You're given a visa choice. Do you go to China or do you go to United States? Where do you send your kids to for education, right? You send them to the United States. Where do European companies which want to do an IPO go? They do it in the United States. Yesterday, a friend of mine was saying there's not a single IPO in the UK in the last 1 year or the last 1.5 years because they've all done that in the US, right? In a way, the United States is like Bangalore, you know. We have a lot of problems. Everybody knows those problems are, but still people come here, right? So I think, the Chinese will probably do well on a per capita basis, on a material basis for the next 20, 30, 40 years. But in terms of the engine of where growth, innovation, prosperity happens, it's still going to be the United States. I'm not rooting. I mean, it's not even that I have to make the case, and the empirical evidence is there. You know.
I'm squeezing in one last question so that we can end on time.
Was to three of us.
Yeah, no. I am happy to let you do the talking.
Two quick questions. One, I'll just lead off from Amit's question. Regardless of this, which is bigger, US, China, both are the biggest trading partners for us. And they are the biggest markets and likely to be so for 10, 20 years. So if strategically we should not be engaging with China, economically, what are we going to do? Are we going to cut ourselves off and leave this big chunk of a market? Or how? And we are already, trading a lot with them. So that's one bit. And the other small thing is, one of the lessons from the war that you talked about, military lessons, seems to me one of those lessons is that there's something not so great about Russian equipment. What does it mean for our army? Thank you.
By the way, 40% of the value add in Indian exports is of Chinese origin today. In 2005, it was 6%. So I'm not sure, and this is why you have Galwan, you say political relations are at their worst, and yet China became your number one trading partner again, and you said records, huge deficit, but this is the reason. So I don't think decoupling or cutting yourself off, I don't think that's a very sensible strategy. What you need to do is to readjust it so that it works for you and that you build some leverage into this relationship. After all, if you're buying so much from somebody, you should manage to, and there I think it's more a question of skill in how you negotiate and how you deal with it. This is a bureaucracy you're dealing with, the Communist Party of China. And you should be able to negotiate, I think, something better on these terms. If you are, after all, $100 billion is not peanuts, even for the Chinese. But on the military equipment, yes, I think you're absolutely right. We need to look very carefully at what we're getting and what we use. Especially because, you've seen that these other dimensions of warfare, the digitized warfare that we've seen in the Ukraine, and the uses of drones, of intelligence, and of various new ways of gathering intelligence and so on. These huge legacy platforms, and you're not fighting Kursk, you're not fighting big tank battles, fighting World War II again, So we need to re-examine that very carefully. But this is why it's not enough just to say, what about the weapons and where do we... Because what Ukraine proves is also that wars are won by not just weapons, but by men and by ideas, and how important the other two things are. And that's what we need to modernize most of all.
Nitin, final comments?
See, I think there is a developmental imperative for us to trade with China. If the Chinese are producing low cost Hawaii chappals, okay, I'm just giving you an example. And let's say the Hawaii chappal which we import from China is 50% cheaper than our local manufacturer. I think we should thank the Chinese for producing that, because we have 300 million poor people, right? We have 300 million poor people who have low purchasing power. And a 50 rupees saved in buying an Hawaii chappal means a lot to that person. So I think there is a moral developmental imperative for us to trade. To the extent that it creates consumer surpluses and benefits our people, we should go ahead and do that. But we should do it carefully, right? For example, if we get the Chinese to invest in ports and highways in India, right, which is dumb infrastructure. It's fine. There's nothing they can do with it. But if you get them to invest in genetic databases in India, that's a problem, right? You get them, get Chinese equipment in our core networks, then that's a problem. So I think we have to be strategic about this. There are certain areas where you don't want Chinese investments or you don't want Chinese equipment because it's a national security risk. There are other areas you welcome it because it doesn't pose a national security risk. And it gives you, as Ambassador Menon said, it gives you negotiating power with them. So there is no one China policy in terms of economics.
Well, that brings us to the conclusion. I think we're right on time, maybe a minute over. And so I want to thank my two panelists for the wonderful exposition they've made on so many different subjects. I want to thank the audience for very interesting questions. And once again, come back to BIC for all our programs. Being on the program committee, I have to say that. Thank you.
So even if you have